Hey guys, so in the last lesson we talked about climate change. We went over some of the evidence of climate change and some of the impacts of climate change. And today we're going to be talking about some of the different ways to fight climate change. Now, some of these different strategies are going to be ways that either individuals or entire countries could right now use to fight climate change. So some of these are applicable right now. Other strategies are ones that have been proposed by scientists but have not been implemented yet, and other ones are ones that have been proposed by scientists and will probably never be implemented. Some of them you'll see are quite far-fetched, but we'll take a look at all of them and go over kind of the pros and cons of them. So when it comes to fighting climate change, again, we're going to go over some of the different strategies. That's going to be the most important part of this lesson. And as far as like a test or quiz go, if I give like an example of a strategy, you will have to know which category of strategy that falls under. And then we're also briefly going to look at some national and international policies that have been made to try and fight climate change. So scientists from around the world have identified climate change as a major concern, but there is still a lot of debate in the scientific community about the best way to actually combat climate change. And there are 4 different categories of strategies in terms of fighting climate change. The first is called climate change mitigation, then climate change adaptation, then weather control, and lastly, geoengineering. And we'll be going through each of these categories one at a time. So when we talk about climate change mitigation, essentially climate change mitigation is anything that limits the amount of climate change. So it focuses on reducing the causes of climate change. So it includes things like reducing greenhouse gas emissions, so supporting cleaner energy, or supporting the use of public transit as opposed to like everyone driving their own car, or decreasing deforestation, stuff like that. So obviously, this is something that can be done, you know, by countries, by local governments, or just by individuals who say choose to, you know, bike to work instead of drive or something like that. Then we have climate change adaptation, which involves limiting the impacts of climate change, but not the amount of climate change. It essentially says, we're just going to let the climate change and try to adapt to that changing climate as best as possible. So that includes things like just moving people away from the coastlines that are flooding, building roads and buildings higher above sea level. It includes like building houses on stilts and stuff like that. Conserving water and energy, so making sure that, you know, you just don't use as much energy or water in your home. This would include things like having water bans. So, you know, some municipalities and some countries say it is, you know, illegal to water your grass. It's illegal to wash your car in your driveway, stuff like that. So it's limiting water use, so water conservation or energy conservation, where a government makes it really expensive to have energy, or makes it illegal to own air conditioners or something like that. Another example is using genetically modified crops. So it might genetically modify crops so that they can survive with less water, for example. Storing rainwater using mosquito nets. So using mosquito nets is a way to adapt to the fact that mosquito vectors can now live in more areas. So instead of trying to reduce the climate change that allows for the spread of mosquitoes, it just does mosquito nets instead. Creating fake snow or covering areas of the ground with white to try and increase albedo. Manually moving plants and animals to suitable habitat if their habitat is no longer suitable for them. So there's a lot of different types of climate change adaptations. All of them doable, some of them less appealing than others. Then you have weather control, which is when scientists use different techniques to essentially try and change the weather in a particular region. So it's usually focusing on making short-term changes to the amount of precipitation. So for example, the most common type of weather control is for areas that are experiencing drought. These techniques will try and increase the amount of precipitation in that area. One example of this is using something called urban heat island effect. Essentially, urban heat island effect is a phenomenon where urban areas absorb more heat than the surrounding area because of all the black and decreased albedo. Therefore, they get hotter. Because it's hotter in those urban areas, there are increased levels of evaporation. And because all that water evaporates, it then travels through the atmosphere where it will eventually condense and then precipitate out further downwind. And it does lead to about 30% more rain about 30 miles downwind of urban areas. So scientists can try and create essentially false urban areas where they just like put down a lot of like black tarp in order to increase the heat of that area, increase the absorption, and then increase the precipitation downwind. Another kind of example of weather control is using chemicals. So in this case, planes are used to spray chemicals into the clouds. It's called cloud seeding. And essentially, those chemicals can start the condensation process, which can produce rain. And this has been used in some countries like China. And then the last main category is geoengineering, which is also referred to as climate control. And this is when we try and change the climate on a global scale. And there's two different subcategories of geoengineering. One is carbon dioxide removal, and the other is solar radiation management. With carbon dioxide removal, that's just what it sounds like. It is removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to try and decrease the greenhouse effect. So some examples of this are just creating more biomass, so planting more trees in order to pull carbon dioxide out of the air with photosynthesis. You can also use scrubbing towers, which artificially like remove carbon dioxide from the air. So it essentially sucks air into the scrubbing tower. The carbon dioxide in the air reacts with compounds in the scrubbing tower and precipitates out of the air. And then the air is released clean of carbon dioxide. You can also increase ocean alkalinity by dissolving massive amounts of limestone in it, which would make the ocean more basic, which allows it to absorb more carbon dioxide. And then carbon dioxide sequestering is the last example. This is where carbon dioxide is pumped underground into areas where oil has been removed. So obviously planting trees is something that people have been doing for a long time now to try and combat climate change. Scrubbing towers is a newer technology, but is probably going to be implemented within the next decade, more widespread. The ocean alkalinity one is probably not something that we're going to see happening because of how much limestone would need to be added to the oceans, and mining that much limestone is not going to be beneficial for the environment. And then carbon dioxide sequestering, again, not widespread at the moment, but it is something that different companies have been looking into, even here in Alberta. Anywhere that oil or natural gas has been removed underground, carbon dioxide can be pumped back in and then sealed in the ground. Solar radiation management, the other type of geoengineering, is when instead of trying to increase the amount of radiation that can leave Earth by limiting the greenhouse effect, solar radiation management tries to limit the amount of radiation that's coming into Earth in the first place. So essentially, you're trying to block some of the solar radiation that's coming from the sun. There's a couple different strategies for this. One is to increase how reflective Earth is, so more solar radiation is reflected away. So that could include things like using reflective sheeting on rooftops instead of having like black or dark shingles. That could, however, cause like vision problems if you're like driving down the road and like a slanted roof is reflecting light towards you. Using fake ice or snow, though making fake ice and snow can cause pollution. So a kind of better alternative to that is just covering areas with like white tarps. Again, time consuming. And then another way to increase the reflectivity of Earth is to fertilize the ocean. So essentially you add nutrients to the ocean, that is going to cause plankton to come to the surface, to eat those nutrients, and then the plankton reflect the light. The downside of that, and the reason why it's probably not going to be something that we see implemented, is that all of those nutrients can cause algal blooms where you have a whole bunch of algae grow in that area. And when the algae dies and decomposes, it essentially uses up all of the oxygen in the water, which can suffocate sea life. We don't want that, obviously. Another kind of strategy of solar radiation management is to increase the atmosphere's reflectivity, which includes things like spraying sulfur into the atmosphere to reflect sunlight. However, that is unlikely to be implemented because it can also cause ozone depletion. Another strategy that's been proposed is to add reflective balloons to the atmosphere, but you would need a lot, and there is worries that that could obviously interfere with the flight patterns of planes and birds. And then the last one is that we could spray seawater into the air to make essentially more clouds, which are reflective. But seawater in the air, or water vapor in the air, can also trap heat radiating away from Earth. So none of these increasing atmospheric reflectivity strategies are very usable at the moment. The Earth ones are a bit more usable. And then the last one, which is even further out there, is to block solar radiation in space before it ever gets to Earth's atmosphere. That includes putting a giant mirror in space, but that would be very time-consuming, expensive, and difficult. Plus, it could get smashed by space debris. And Russian scientists have also suggested a lunar missile, where we shoot a missile at the moon to blow it up, which would create a lot of dust and debris between us and the sun, which could then block some sunlight. However, if you blew up too much of the moon and created too much dust, it could result in an ice age and the death of all living things. Also, there are processes here on Earth that rely on the moon, like the tides, and getting rid of the moon could have some really disastrous consequences. However, it is actually a cheaper option than some of the others that we've looked at. So anyway, as far as those go, solar radiation management, probably not going to be on the top of anyone's list in terms of fighting climate change. Carbon dioxide removal, some of those strategies are a lot more doable, and we're probably going to see them implemented within the next decade. Weather control has been used in some countries. We're probably not going to see a lot of it here in Canada. Climate change adaptation and climate change mitigation, some of those strategies are definitely already happening in different places around the world. Okay, so again, when it comes to test and quizzes, if I give you an example, you have to tell me which main category it falls into. So if I say carbon dioxide sequestering, you should know that is a geoengineering category of strategy, that sort of thing. Okay. Lastly, we're going to briefly look at some government policies that have been put in place to try and fight climate change. Many governments are slow to act in the fight against climate change because it is often frowned upon by major industries. It's very costly for major industries to like change their infrastructure in order to be more environmentally friendly, and industry can put a lot of pressure on governments not to change because of how much monetary influence they have. But there are a couple international and national policies we're going to look at. The first is the Montreal Protocol, which is essentially the agreement that was put in place to stop the use of CFCs, the chemicals that depleted the ozone layer. Back in 1987, it was signed by 182 countries, including Canada. There's also the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which essentially says that countries should reduce the human causes of climate change and support sustainable practices. The Kyoto Protocol was an international agreement where countries said they would reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. 160 countries, including Canada, signed the agreement in 1998. But many haven't followed through on it, and Canada actually abandoned this under the Harper government. It was the first country that signed the Kyoto Protocol to officially withdraw. In 2000, Canada put forth an action plan on climate change that said that starting in 2000, Canada was going to develop and use cars that run on hydrogen fuel cells and biomass fuel, increase the amount of carbon dioxide recaptured from industries, increase the efficiency of fossil fuels, use more renewable energy sources, build more energy efficient buildings, plant trees, etc. A lot of that hasn't been done other than more renewable energy sources being implemented in some parts of the country. Climate change denial is essentially when industries or people deny climate change. And usually this is because all of these changes in order to fight climate change are expensive, and industries that produce a lot of greenhouse gases don't want to change their practices and risk losing money. This has been a problem in Canada in the past, though it is a much bigger problem in the United States. And that mostly had to do with the strength of the industrial lobby groups in the States, which essentially donate millions of dollars to politicians who deny climate change and also pay the media to downplay the causes, effects, and realness of climate change. Only about 49% of Americans believed in climate change back in 2008, which I realize is an out-of-date statistic now, but that is compared to 90% of the international population, which believed in climate change back then. I would hope that those numbers have gone up since 2008, since, you know, so much more has been learned about climate change and so much more evidence has been found for it. But I don't know. People in developing countries are less likely to believe in climate change compared to people in developed countries, with the exception of the United States and Russia, again, because of the power of their lobbying groups. More educated people are also more likely to believe in climate change. 98% of university grads believe in climate change compared to only 63% of people who have only a high school education. And that is going to be it for today's lesson. I will try and find some more up-to-date statistics on climate change denial. I think I saw some come out in 2020 this year. So I'll get back to you if I find any of those.